Aye. All opposed, no. The motion carries unanimously. Okay. The first bill will be Delegate Levine's bill, House Bill H63. Other than ministers who may celebrate the rights of marriage, filing of marriage records. Okay, Delegate Levine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is the bill, yes, that allows parties to choose their own wedding officiant. It gets rid of the unconstitutional problem that favored religious people chosen over secular people, but more importantly, it's just a lot more practical for people to be able to choose their own officiant. It could be Uncle Joe who lives in Idaho. It could be your best friend Sue from college. It could be whoever the parties want without going through the incredible red tape that I had to go through in Alexandria, going to court 4 times, getting a notary, $5 bond, so forth. We started this last time, and Mr. Benjamin had some very good ideas, I think, to amend the bill that he can present to you.
Mr. Chairman.
First of all, let's walk through the problems of the bill, and then we can get to
Let me put it in good form first for you, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I've thanked Delegate Levine for working with me through the weekend, and for Kristen with also working very hard on this. These are minor but important amendments that need to be made on line 17. After the word officiant, strike the word who and insert comma in either such officiant or party to the marriage, and then strike the new language that appears on line 18. Let me tell you what the amendments would be, and then perhaps, Mr. Chairman, they could be moved as a block if any member chooses. On lines 28 and 29, strike the sentence that begins any person. The effect of striking that sentence, Mr. Chairman, is to remove the bond requirement for persons other than ministers. On line 44, strike the word one, replace it with the word a.
This is what line again?
That's on line 44. At the end of line 44, you'll see the word one. That should be a. And then on line 60, and Kristen tells me other bills have accomplished this, but to be consistent, on line 60, strike the words and race. Those are the amendments that I would suggest, Mr. Chairman.
All right, walk us through what the bill does then.
Well, with the amendments, just do them.
All right, okay. All in favor of the amendments, say aye. Aye, all opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's one additional one on line 66 to strike the word the at the end of the line and insert pursuant to section 20-16, either the, and then it would go on to read officiant or a party to the marriage shall file. So
That's
that
correct.
matches up with
66, the word the, T-H-E, at the end of the line?
Yes, sir. And insert pursuant to 20-16, either the.
Okay, all right. Yeah, all in favor, say aye. All opposed, no. Okay.
Walking you through the bill,
Walk
Mr.
us
Chairman,
through it.
here's what the bill does. On line 17, this permits, currently the officiant is required to return the completed copies of the wedding certificate to the clerk. Line 17 permits a party to the marriage to return the completed marriage certificates to the clerk. Lines 28 and 29, as well as lines 46 and 47, these remove the bond requirements that exist for people who are, for secular officiants and for persons who are members of religious societies who don't have ordained ministers. It's necessary to do that, Mr. Chairman, because the section that deals with ordained ministers does not require a bond in order to maintain a neutral effect, which is important for Establishment Clause, First Amendment reasons. You have to remove the bond requirement in those two instances. On line 44, 1 is changed to A, and the effect of that, I think, was an unintended numerical limitation on religious societies. Lines 52 and 53, this removes incarceration as a penalty for conducting a wedding without a license, without a marriage license, or an officiant acting without authority. Line 60 removes the words "and race." Lines 66 and 67 also permit a party to the marriage to file the completed certificate in addition to the officiant. And then line 93, this repeals 4 sections of the code. 20-21 is a section of the code that says that the clerk is to furnish a list of unreturned licenses to the Commonwealth's attorney. Section 20-22 provides that the Commonwealth attorney is to determine the name of the officiant who did not return a license and certificate to the clerk. Lines 20 and Section 20-24 says that a minister who doesn't file the certificate is fined $25. Section 20-37 validates certain marriages that were solemnized prior to 1904. The bill presents essentially 2 policy considerations for the committee, Mr. Chairman. The first policy consideration is at lines 37 through 41. These provisions, as the delegate has told you, permit parties to a marriage to designate their own officiant. The only requirements is that the officiant must be at least 18 years old and cannot be a party to the marriage. There is no geographical restriction. There's no other condition. The second policy consideration is the repeal of 20-21 and 20-22. Those 2 sections are not well written. It's not clear how they work, but they are the only enforcement provisions, if you will, for situations when licenses are issued and then not returned.
Which line is that?
That's line 93. You'll see 20-21 and 20-22. They are repealed. Those are the 2 policy considerations.
Let me ask you this. I think you said any party to the marriage or the officiant can file the
Completed wedding certificate, yes.
anybody, the party, how you gonna make a party do it? Suppose they don't do it? I mean, what's the enforcement mechanism there?
Mr. Chairman, may I answer that question?
Yeah.
I think that no one wants marriage certificates filed and parties properly married more than the parties. I would argue the parties care about being married more than the wedding officiant. They want to be married. They got a license. They decided to be married. They went through a ceremony. They're the ones who are going to want to be married. It does allow the wedding officiant to return. That's actually current law. This actually allows for more people to return a certificate. One of the concerns raised was, this very old statute 100 years ago that you're going to find all the wedding officiants that didn't return their certificates, report to the Commonwealth attorney. It's a lot easier if a wedding officiant isn't doing it, if the parties just do it themselves. I've been talking a lot with the clerks of the court about this bill, several clerks, and what they say is it's only a handful that aren't returned in a year. They think it may be that the parties decided not to actually get married. But the way it works, at least in Arlington, is that if people go and they say, hey, I need a marriage certificate, maybe they need it for a loan or they need it for all kinds of reasons that people want a marriage certificate, they look, they see if it's there. If it's not there, then they can reapply and get it there. So the only harm of not returning a marriage certificate really is to the parties themselves, which is why they have an incentive to do it.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Morrissey.
Let me give you a practical reason why you might want other people, other than the officiant, to be able to do it, i.e. the parties. A very good friend of mine, Lee Young, who was a former mayor of the city and a candidate for the House, married his daughter but passed of cancer. And 6 months, 12 months later, they're wondering, they couldn't determine what he had done. So that's a reason to allow the parties to the marriage to do it. But here's my question for the delegate. I've learned through the years that the quickest way to make sure a project doesn't get accomplished is to give 2 people the task. So I'm somewhat concerned that now 2 people, the officiant and the people that are getting married, each have the task or the authority to return the paperwork. Have you considered that and assuaged me that that's not a concern of yours?
Well,
I want to support the bill.
one thing we could do is we could have the clerk inform the parties that's been returned so that they know. I think that may be one way out of it. My goal was to make more return, not less. And I do understand your concerns, Senator Morrissey. I think maybe simply a notice requirement might solve that problem, so the parties know it was returned. Having done 4 of these myself, I can tell you that I was in close contact with, I was the wedding officiant, close contact with the parties to the marriage. They were making sure I was doing my job, and I was making sure they were doing their job. Part of the problem with all this red tape is that even under current law, it's still complicated because the parties have to return their license and the wedding officiant has to return the solemnization. Since the parties have to go back to the clerk anyway to return their license, it's easy just to return the solemnization along with it. I actually think it's simpler for them to do that. Yeah.
One final question. Right now, if the officiant doesn't return the document, the people get married before 400 people in a wonderful ceremony. They then have 4 children, and they have their life. If that document is not returned, isn't it true that they are not legally married?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, Senator Marcy, that's not true. 2031 says if you believe you are married, you're married even if the certificate's not returned, and that's under current law.
Mr. Chairman, that's almost correct.
Okay.
There has to be a license. So long as the parties are solemnized pursuant to a marriage license, then any defect doesn't matter.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, Senator Peterson.
Delegate, I'd sort of focus on the example of my own marriage. I was young when I got married. My wife was even younger. The last thing we were interested in was going back to the courthouse after the ceremony was over. So I think the idea of having the officiant turn it in is that you want someone who is a responsible person, someone with some standing in the community. Maybe a pastor, maybe a judge, but somebody who has some gravity in the community that's going to make sure that the proper paperwork gets filed while these 2 young people are flying off to Bermuda or wherever they're going to go. And then, to be honest, having been a young person a long time ago, you're not interested in paperwork once you get married. You're interested in being with the person that you love. And I think that was the idea behind the statute. Do you have a response to that?
Well, I would say that, first of all, again, the wedding officiant can still return the paperwork. So this is an either or. And if they don't, as we pointed out, they're still married under 2031. It allows the parties to do it. When I performed these marriages, the parties still had to return their paperwork because depending on due to the complexities of Virginia law, if the wedding officiant, I was from Alexandria, the people I was marrying reside in Richmond, they had to return their paperwork in Richmond, and then I had to get the certified copy of it and return it in Alexandria. There's a lot of red tape here. So I decided to go to court in Alexandria 4 times, file an order, get permission from the judge, get a notary, get a bond. But we had to do that anyway. So I would argue the parties already have to return the form, and this actually simplifies it because they can still do it.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
Senator Peterson.
And leaving the paperwork aside, the gravity of your bill, as I understand, is that anyone can really be an officiant as long as they're an adult.
Chosen by the parties.
Chosen by the parties. And again, I come perhaps from a more traditional era that someone in the community that has some gravity. Maybe it's a state delegate. Maybe it's a judge. Maybe it's a pastor. Maybe it's someone who's willing to go through the steps, but it's not just anybody off the street. That marriage is something that's solemn, that it's profound, that it's meant to last, that it's meant to, in certain cases, bring children into the world. And so, again, you're looking for somebody who's not just, your drinking buddy from college, so to speak, somebody with some amount of community standing. I'm just saying, this is what the idea behind the statute was. You don't think that's important?
Well, I would say, Senator, that judges can still do it. Ministers can still do it. We don't change that part of the law. There are a number of designated officials that still the judge, every community has sort of the designated marriage officiants. They can still designate them.
Mr. Chairman, let me add to that answer as well for Senator Peterson.
Senator Benjamin. Senator almost. Benjamin.
It's important that the committee understand that there are 2 things that are required for a lawful marriage, and that is the issuance of a license and solemnization. We think of solemnization as being a wedding ceremony, but solemnization does not require any kind of ceremony. Moreover, I think the statutes clearly contemplate that first you must get a marriage license before you have the solemnization. However, in 2017, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled this way. The parties had a wedding. They didn't have the license. The rabbi informed them that they needed to get a license. And so they said they would after the ceremony. They eventually got the license. They mailed it to the rabbi, and about 30 days later, the rabbi returned it to the clerk's office. 10 years later, the parties are divorcing. The husband asserts that it was a void marriage because there wasn't a license issued before the solemnization. The trial court agreed, the Court of Appeals agreed, the Virginia Supreme Court said no. When the parties mailed in that completed certificate, that was a solemnization. So the answer is that although we think of a ceremony and a solemn proceeding, the law as interpreted by the Virginia Supreme Court now is that virtually anything that the parties do can amount to a solemnization.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Boyce.
question for the patron. So I support in context, in theory, in concept, what you're trying to do. I've performed a marriage for friends of mine in New York City. What Senator Peterson brought up, the fact that it might be best to have someone who is of standing in a community. What kind of concerns me a little bit is that one of the parties could turn in all of the paperwork. What if this wasn't a real marriage? What if someone is being coerced and forced into a marriage by, perhaps a younger person being forced by someone who is more powerful than them, and the more powerful one fills out all the paperwork and turns it in. I like the idea that there is a third person of standing in the community who has been with the couple, who has seen them, through this. I like the idea that you are bringing forward. I just have a little bit of concern, and I'm wondering if that has been addressed or if there's already a safeguard.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Boysko, the marriage license itself requires both parties to sign. So this isn't a case of one party fills out all the paperwork and the other person. They have to both show up at the clerk's office, who is a person of some authority elected in the community, and that office sees both of the parties to the marriage before they even issue the license in the first place. And I do have some people I know want to talk about this, but what I found is, and I've gotten emails on this as well, people say, my father or my teacher or my mentor who lives out of state wanted to perform the marriage. We can't legally do that in Virginia, and they can't. You cannot get married in Virginia today if the person of longstanding, a great judge from the state of Maryland, or your congressman who's in D.C., if they're not a Virginia resident, they can't perform the marriage at all under current law. This allows out-of-state people to do it. It also, yes, it allows the parties to choose, and part of this, I think, goes to sort of giving the right of people to make their own choices. We may not like their wedding officiant, but is it really the business of the state to determine that John and Sue should have this wedding officiant? It's their marriage, it's their lives. Maybe they pick an old drinking buddy, but I think most don't. I think most couples do pick someone of some kind of standing, but the out-of-state
Mr.
provision,
Chairman.
it's really concerning.
Yeah, Senator Sessler.
There are probably some couples that didn't stay married as long as we've been talking about this bill. And we either need to report it or carry it over for the year.
There's a lot of issues here.
Could I have some of the people speak to it?
Yeah, go ahead, have somebody speak to it.
All right. Got a couple of people that I know want to
No, let's just.
give their view.
Yeah, do 2 minutes.
Let's see. Okay, they're not gonna be that long. Go ahead.
Good morning, I'm Felicia Blackwell. I just wanted to say that I've had 3 daughters that has been married, and we've always discussed that I would perform their marriage. And that wasn't able to happen here in the state of Virginia. However, I just feel personally that marriage is sacred, and I think someone said that. I believe that that's the most important decision that we will ever make in our lives. And I feel that whomever the couple choose to be the officiant should be that person. And I think that they have the right to say, well, if it's my mom, and that's who I feel more comfortable with, that's who it should have been. And that's my
All
statement.
right. Anybody else want to speak in favor of it? Okay.
Hi, thank you, Senator Edwards, and for the opportunity to speak in favor of HB 863. I'm Rick Clore, resident in Orange, Virginia, and a Baptist pastor. And I speak in favor of this because I've had to stand alongside those folks not bonded just so that a marriage would be legal, because they really didn't want a minister to do it, but they asked me to stand in, hey, make this legal for us. So it's going to simplify a lot of things, especially for persons that, officiants that the couple chooses that are not state residents. Make it a lot easier. And frankly, in ministerial circles that I talk to across the religious spectrum, we really find this requirement to be bonded kind of laughable. We don't necessarily like being agents of the state. We find that our authority comes from God more than the state, and so it's a little bit of an infringement on what we think. We really find this a little bit maybe a hangover from our colonial past when we paid taxes to a state church. And so we really would say, let's get rid of this law and free it up and let couples choose who they want to marry them. I believe in the sacred nature of matrimony, of course, and I do understand a lot of the arguments here today, but what I've learned is people, we as Baptists anyway, express freedom of the individual. And so we have to stand on the side of the person to choose, and so I stand in favor of HB 863.
You're aware that marriage is not just a religious matter. In fact, it might not even be a religious matter. You get a civil marriage. But there's a reason that the state has an interest in this. Equitable distribution of property, the tendency by the entirety of the right of survivorship, there, the whole series of things, tax issues that flow from being married. Therefore, the state does have an interest in how it's done.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Chairman, let me clarify one thing. There is no prohibition in the law of anybody from anywhere performing or officiating over a wedding ceremony. You can designate anybody to do that so long as one of the authorized officiants also witnesses it and signs the marriage certificate.
True, and I will speak from a ministerial point of view. That's not sufficient for me because I take my role seriously as a minister. I will not just sign off on a document. I have to participate. So if they ask me to sign on it, then I have to bring in my faith to the marriage ceremony. So that is a challenge for ministers, not just to sign a document for someone else.
Okay, anybody speak in favor, anybody speak against it? I have some questions. I think some of the other people here have had questions. I'm really concerned about anybody doing this. And by the way, if you look at the lines above this, any judge, et cetera, that's my bill several years ago.
We're not touching that.
I've had several, no, I know it doesn't. But shouldn't there be, somebody of standing, for example, suppose a guy just got out of prison for axe murder, and he decides he's from Alaska, and he comes in and says he wants to, and the parties say, I want him to be the marriage officiant.
Well, I guess I would say, Mr. Chairman, that if the person is a minister, they can do it. But if they're not a minister, they can't, which is why the Seventh Circuit found this whole scheme unconstitutional. And I think they would find it unconstitutional in the Fourth Circuit, too. Because what it says is if you're an axe murderer and a minister in Alaska, you can marry them. But if you're an axe murderer in Alaska and you're not a minister, you can't, which is why I think the whole current scheme violates the First Amendment. And again, the Seventh Circuit agrees with me on
Mr.
this.
Chair.
We've discussed.
One at a time, let me see.
We did discuss this, and the Seventh Circuit had a different statutory scheme. With the corrections, the amendments that have been made, it's my opinion that our present statutory scheme is not unconstitutional.
Mr. Chair.
Senator McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, you will have someone of standing in the community involved in making sure that this marriage is legal, and that's the clerk of the court, who has to issue the marriage license and who has to also record the marriage certificate, which is then recorded with the Department of Vital Statistics. What we need to recognize is times have changed, and different generations have different views about who they want to conduct their marriage ceremony. There are people who want their best friend to do the ceremony. There are people who want the person who was involved in the couple getting introduced to each other in the first place to perform the ceremony. It's not for us to decide whether that's an appropriate person to perform the ceremony or not. It should be their right to decide who will perform the ceremony. But for the putting the stamp of the Commonwealth on that marriage, that is going to happen when they get their marriage certificate and when the marriage license is filed with the court. And for those reasons, I think we just need to recognize that for a whole new generation, 40 and younger, it is not as important to them, whether we like it or not, that a religious celebrant perform the ceremony, and we ought not, yes, and so for those reasons, I move to report as amended.
I don't know if we've adopted the, maybe we don't adopt the amendment? Okay.
Yes.
Who's supposed to file this with the clerk of court now?
It can either be the officiant, him or herself, or the parties to the marriage can file. And again, the parties to the marriage have to return the license anyway, so while they're there, they can simply file. And I think actually that's more convenient for them. But if they don't do it, the wedding officiant can still do it.
Yeah. I think it ought to be studied for a year, but whatever the will of the body is, there's a motion to report the bill as amended. Is there a second? Second. All right, all in favor vote aye, all opposed vote no.
All right, thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. Members of the committee. All 100 House members supported, by the way, but thank you. No, I appreciate your time.
Thank you.